well, one question that was brought up is the rabbit doesn't have the choice to leave the space, while the people do. That, of course, is an ethical question that animal rights people, the animal liberation movement people would bring up, especially in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I think the fact that now it's not being brought up as much is because first we've become very desensitized, I guess, towards the question, maybe. Or maybe because there is a more awareness of a sort of unfreedom of the whole, to go back to the question of freedom. I mean, in what way are the two performers actually free? In what way are the visitors free? Even if you can leave the gallery space, you're still in the city and you're stuck, constrained by a number of conditions. So this question of the freedom to participate or not in a performance for non-humans is, I think, in different terms than it was laid out 20 years ago or 30 years ago when Kunelis was showing his live horses. I think that there are many possibilities. I mean, the rabbit was certainly not in a cage, and the rabbit was not asked to be part of the performance. The rabbit could have chosen to eat all the carrots right away and then it would have ended immediately. The rabbit could have chosen to not observe or to observe, and indeed did participate in some moments and some didn't, and had a certain number of choices that were possible. Whether to disrupt the game immediately and end it or to not is the primary one. And I think there's both the monks and the rabbit are also mutually limiting each other's freedoms. The humans can't play the game that they had intended to play as freely, or it's subject to the will of the rabbit. So that was one point. But I also think that in the arts, I mean, we are sometimes a little bit too self-critical. In the sense that this is very different from pouring some perfume on a rabbit to see if the skin is irritated in order to produce the perfume for us to buy. I think it's a very different situation, more one of a domestic animal. So why do you accept the domesticity of the animal and not accept the performing of the animal in the artwork? So it's, again, a gray zone. The other point, Alison, what was the other thing we were saying? Oh yes, that in her experiment, I answered, I remember the answer, that it was that one of the primary experimental aspects of this, if you want to say scientific, she used to say that when she was working on this, that it was like a science experiment. And I said, well, in what way is it a science experiment? She said, well, you know, I'm testing if the rabbit will prefer to watch the performance, play the game, or eat the carrots. I mean, is it true that that undoubtedly a hungry rabbit will go and eat the carrots, or will there be another choice possible that is less intuitive if one thinks of animals as only having, you know, nutritive desires, as even Agamben almost says in his book L'Aperto. You know, he says animals don't make worlds in his legacy of Heideggerian Weltmachen, which. So basically, she's provoking that and testing if that's true, and the result is no, it's not true. The rabbit did a little bit of everything and was quite interested in what these maniac non-rabbits were doing, even though the rabbit couldn't understand what the maniac non-rabbits were doing. But certainly these non-rabbits were doing this thing that didn't seem to be determined by a desire for survival. So probably that was the opinion of the rabbit. Okay, and here's the rabbit resting when there's no game anymore. Okay, the piece that I most wanted to show you is an interesting work titled "One of the Things That Baffles Me About You is That You Remain Unmurdered." Part 1. Durational, the method, the technique is, it's a durational life gesture with the main project, part 2, still to be completed. Now, when she decided to do this project, she got a chicken, domesticated the chicken, and lives with the chicken in her house. She has even designed the poster for the project, but has not yet found a gallery that will host it. This is the poster for the project. Of the exhibition follows the inhibition. During the inhibition, the gallery will be closed. And the inhibition is the part that's not public. When she was planning on living for a month, for example, in Paris in a gallery with this chicken. The exhibition, the public part 2, still to be completed, is the confidential part here, which is that without telling the public, so the public, I mean, you know this, and I'm telling you this, but also because it seems to appear that it's practically impossible. She's tried many places. She even won an award for her piece in Documenta that was a residency and an exhibition in a location where she said, fine, I'd love to do it, and this is my proposal. And they read the proposal and said, no, you can have the money of the prize, but you can't do the exhibition. And so she just gave it up because it didn't make sense. So the second part, which is not communicated to the audience in advance, so that there's not a sense of leading up towards this, is the killing and the cooking of the chicken, that she would, wring the chicken's neck and boil it and make broth and serve the broth and eat. So it's similar to it was conceived before the Sol Marie Rose piece. This is an older piece. But the first part is the most interesting part. The so-called inhibition is happening in her house. It was supposed to be just temporary in her house to go towards the exhibition, the inhibition part in a public gallery, closed public gallery. But because nobody has wanted it, she has now been living with this chicken for a year. And the point of the exercise here, or let's say if it's an experiment, a scientific experiment, or adopting from science something, is to attempt to enter into a love relationship with the chicken. So sleeping with the chicken, eating with the chicken, waking up with the chicken, working with the chicken, riding with the chicken on the desk, and also learning what the chicken wants to do, doing things that the chicken wants to do, and doing them with the chicken in the house. So it's sharing also different desires and learning what are the desires of the other non-human animal, with the clear intention of bonding, and it's like adopting a child or something, creating a love relationship intentionally, studying chicken behavior, chicken life, and so on. So this certainly is not chicken run. And her experiment is also about what emotional impact it will have on her after a month, but now it's been a year, to kill and eat the chicken, So it's a lover. I mean, it's a question of love and death and eros and thanatos. There's always many levels in Christina's work. Some are purely cultural, like investigating the love, the eros, thanatos impulses. Sexuality as la piccola morte, the little death of the separation after the orgasmo, and so on. And such a beautiful image, I think, this one. Because when you see close-up, interesting in relation to what you were saying about the individual, when you see close-up, for example, you really sense a relationship between a sentient being and a habitat that's been constructed, a home, much more than when you see the group of hundreds of bees and wasps, and the caring for this vase, the embracing of it, and the ways that co-evolution of artistic styles, the way that we have also, we learn from birds' music, we learn from bees' how to make both their habitats, trying to make a habitat similar, good for them, but also how it influences then our own architectures and so on. And then vice versa, our presumptions on our own architecture, modernist architecture, must be the best for bees too, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so that's another image of her in the kitchen making breakfast for both. I think this was interesting to her because it was a moment when the chicken really wanted to suntan. So there are all these domestic moments that are recorded in these photographs. There are many, many photographs also. But she doesn't consider the photographs as an artwork. But they're quite interesting, actually. Okay, so one of the things that baffles me about you is that you remain unmurdered. This particular piece that so far has lasted 260 days instead of a month. She writes, like a continuation of the almost monastic devotion and ritual that quietly sustained the lover at Documenta 13, which is the butterfly project, I propose a piece that continues that path of almost absurd devotion. I will spend 1 or 2 months with a white hen in a gallery space. The gallery will be open to visitors only from midnight to 6 a.m., a time that I will spend with a chicken in an atmosphere of intimate communion, a vigil of what could be seen as prayer, quiet observation, a being with the other, a wanting to know the other profoundly. She uses words with care. Profoundly for her has something to do with all of the religious terminology she's using. The chicken will remain in the gallery space during the day, laying unfertilized eggs day after day, which accumulate as a trace, scattered around the gallery space until the end of the show. During the last night of the show, I'll kill the chicken in a seemingly gentle gesture that might even escape the eye as an act of killing. I will make a bouillon for a final dinner at the finissage to which friends, colleagues, and others will be invited. It is important that during the entire show, it is not announced that the chicken will be killed in the end. I want people to focus on this strange moment and atmosphere of intimacy and not be distracted by what will come. People should uninitiatedly gather for the final dinner, some being aware, others perhaps being less aware of what is going on. As I was not allowed to realize the above project as planned in December 2012, the pre-project poster overleaf has now become part of the project, which is that poster. The main part, as described here, is still in search for a suitable institution to be realized at. So, I find it particularly interesting that something like this is not allowed in art institutions, and she's tried all over the place. Even when the curators say, yes, of course, we can do this, somebody says no. And it's because of what she sees as a sort of hypocrisy of the society. I mean, animals, non-human animals are killed constantly, and people are eating chicken constantly. But to turn it into something on a symbolic level, in the space of the purposelessness of art, suddenly contrasts with a form of ethics that one can only kill if it's purposeful. But what if art is purposeful? So to go back to that initial question of today, I think is this aporia that she wants to have us think about. So that's that piece. In concerning the lover was the piece which was inspired by Ovid's Metamorphoses and also by other poems about butterflies. There's that famous Indian contemporary poet on the butterfly, Tagore on the butterfly, which is a poem about the relativity of time and perception of time and space from different points of view. So it's a kind of an uexcule poem that says that the life of the butterfly is a long life, which seems short for us. So this is her house in Kassel. And this photograph I find very interesting formally. Again, it's not an artwork, but it is her photograph, and she chooses to use it to describe the project, where suddenly she uses the camera to to tinifies. How do you say to tinifies? To make small. Miniaturize her own feet, but carefully wears these white shoes so that they're very visible and noticeable. Somehow working on this question of scale of perception, the close-up perception, the perception of something being small or something being large, and how I think her photographs are actually very interesting in relation to her projects as a whole. This is another image that she likes of the garden for butterflies, which of course suggests the perspective more from the perspective of the butterfly than this one, and certainly more than this one, and more than this one, and more than this one. But on the other hand, there's also flying and different moments of perception. And one of the important things about this piece was also in relation to what we just discussed about the rabbit, is that this piece was contingent, and she was very aware of it. That's why she lived there the whole summer and bred the butterflies in her home, is the fact that the butterflies would fly away, most probably, because her garden, even though lovingly created with plants that the particular butterflies of the region are attracted to, and that's the choice of the flowers is only based on the plants that these butterflies of the region enjoy. She knew that they would fly away, most probably because of the incredible size of the Aue Park nearby. So she positioned it outside of the Aue Park, but near the Aue Park. So it's a very interesting, not cruel project, because if you position it in a very urban area, like at the train station, you would have had a difficulty for the butterflies to find other plants nearby. And it would be pushing them to stay with those flowers, so it would have been more successful in a way. But it was important to her that the butterflies would actually migrate towards the Pierre Huyghe. There's even a kind of subtle competitiveness between her and Pierre Huyghe piece. This is much less spectacular than the Pierre Huyghe piece. And she was always saying that the butterflies in Pierre Huyghe she had actually bred. They weren't just there because he had put plants there. So this devotion that she speaks about is a devotion to constantly breeding more children. Again, there's a maternity thing, constantly having these children, breeding these in the house, and yet them flying away, the giving up the control over where they're going to be. So that was written about. She writes about the doing and loving and devoting despite, quote unquote, the doing and loving and devoting despite. The planning and looking after the garden, as well as the continuous hatching and releasing of the butterflies, became a ritual without planning, a quiet, secluded life gesture, aspect of the work that was almost prayerful, passionate, and devoted, despite all adversaries like the wind and the rain that on daily basis carried the butterflies away that had just been released. This, quote, doing and loving and devoting despite, néanmoins, nonostante, despite, was the central element of the piece. And when she speaks about it as in relation to freedom, speaking about freedom again, and to close this session, or the possibility of freedom, she writes in her notes about desires and how they bind or release us, about the abyss of the wide open, because of course you can't contain the sculpture, it's uncontainable, about poiesis, literally the bringing into being. It's boundless, cannot be completely controlled, owned, and contained. It plays with our expectations and it surprises us in the most unlikely ways, because of course one day the butterflies might stay longer, other day less. So she could never know how many she would need to actually send back to the piece. It plays with our expectations and it surprises us in the most unlikely ways. It calls us to dwell, to observe quietly, to hope, and to be disappointed by our own expectations. This constant failure of releasing the butterflies and them going off. It is a passionate and inexhaustible engagement with the ephemeral and the futile, a desire for the quiet gesture, a work that withdraws itself from the spectacle. It is a gift that has a beginning but no end. So that's what I needed to tell you about Christina's work and her lovely photographs, which are not art according to her. Yalla. Christina Buch, this is sorry, I mean, yes, let's take that break, but this, because I'm going to forget this thought about the chimp making sculpture. She speaks a lot about the ethical problems in teaching animals to make art, which is human art, like sculpture and painting. But she also doesn't see it in such a simple way as, oh no, that's really bad. That's like anthropomorphizing animals and constricting them into things that they're not doing and so on. Because she also sees and reminds me that we sing and we make music probably because we were copying other animals, in any case, with flutes and things. But mostly, I wanted to say that from a science perspective, in speaking about trans-species studies and alliances between artists and non-artists, and when we were speaking about what can be done that is not always done if you're not in the arts, although there had been people who studied, the very famous London Zoo man who studied painting by chimps and so on, there had never been, until this piece, a case of a scientist interested in seeing what chimps do with plastiline. So this is a case of an artist actually doing science, if you wish, to study what the behavior would be if you give a block of clay to a chimp. So it never occurred to any scientist. And that's why Desmond Morris, she became quite close with him, because he was really surprised that he had never thought of it. He's the one who had done the painting experiments. So a case where it is it science, is it art, to study the behavior of this animal with this crete.